What is the employer's role in the PERM labor certification process? That's what we're talking about on today's episode of Live at Lunch. My name is Emily Sumner with Sumner Immigration Law. Let's talk about this. A client recently asked me, what is the employer's role? And I thought that was a great question because a lot of times before employers or companies commit to sponsoring someone for permanent resident, they want to know exactly what their role will be, what will be involved, what will their tasks be, kind of what is the time commitment? And that's a great question. I want everybody to be aware of what's involved before we begin the process. So let's talk about that. First of all, let's talk about briefly what is the PERM labor certification process. It is the first step in the employment-based green card process. There are other types of employment-based green card processes, but this is the process that most employees and employers will go through when an employer wants to sponsor their foreign national worker for permanent residence in the United States. So the PERM labor certification process, like I said, is the first stage of 3 stages. The second stage is the I-140 petition, and then the third stage is the I-485 or consular processing. And that's when the foreign national actually applies for permanent residence in the United States. So this first stage, the PERM labor certification stage, the purpose is the employer has to show that there are no qualified U.S. workers. So no U.S. workers who are willing, available, or qualified for the position. There is a series of steps that the employer has to go through to establish this. It's dictated by the Department of Labor regulations, and they are very, very specific. The process is not what you would do in real life if you were searching to fill a position, but instead it's dictated by the Department of Labor regulations. So what is the employer's role in this process? First thing to know is that it is an employer-driven process. Here at Sumner Immigration Law, my team and I try to streamline the process as much as possible. We do as much as we can for the employer and the employee. However, there's some things that the employer has to do. So those things include paying for the process. The labor certification regulations, the Department of Labor regulations are very clear that the employer has to pay the legal fees and advertising fees associated with the PERM stage of the process. That's not necessarily true for the I-140 petition and the I-485 filing, stages 2 and 3. But for this first stage of the process, the employer absolutely has to pay. The employee cannot reimburse them. The employer cannot take money out of their paycheck to cover the costs. It has to be paid for by the employer. It's important to note that at least as of right now, as of June 2025, there is no government filing fee, no Department of Labor filing fee. So it's the legal fees and the advertising fees that the employer would be covering. The employer also has to define the position. So typically that's kind of already done, right? Typically a company will come to us and say, hey, we want to sponsor John Smith for a PERM labor certification, and he's working as a XYZ, and whatever the position is. So typically that's already done, but we have to get really clear on what the job title is, what the job duties are, and what are the minimum requirements for the position. And that's something, all of those are things that we help employers with. The information, of course, has to be accurate. It, of course, has to be reality. It can't just be made up, but there are strategic considerations that go into all that. So we are here to help the employer walk through that process and make sure that everything is aligned in such a way that the case is likely to be successful. But we do have to have something to start with, and that includes the job title, the job duties, and the minimum requirements for the position, emphasis on minimum. We're not talking about what are the job qualifications or requirements that are preferred or that the person actually has or that they have historically asked for necessarily, but we're asking what are the actual current minimum requirements for the position. The employer also needs to set the wage for the position, or at least have an idea of what they are willing and able to pay for the position. That's also something that goes into case strategy. Part of the process of the PERM labor certification process is obtaining what's called a prevailing wage determination from the Department of Labor. That's something that we submit for the employer once they've reviewed everything and based on information that they give to us. But basically, the Department of Labor will come back on that prevailing wage determination and say, okay, employer, based on this information, the job title, the job duties, the requirements, the geographic location, you have to pay this person at least X amount per year as of the time that they receive the green card, which could be in the future. It does not have to be right now, but you do have to show as the employer that you have the ability to pay that wage as of the date that you file the I-140 petition. And our last video last Tuesday for Live at Lunch was actually about the ability to pay. So if you're interested in that, definitely check that out. But bottom line is you have to generally give us a wage range that you're comfortable with, and then we will ask for documentation for ability to pay. We want to make sure that you have that ability to pay, or at least are likely to when we begin the process. In addition, once we have obtained the prevailing wage determination and we're ready to start recruitment, that means that we are ready to place a series of ads in different places, different strategies, tactics there to show that, or to ask for resumes basically, or applications to show that there's no US worker who's willing, qualified, or available for the position. We structure that process according to the regulations. We make sure that you're compliant with the regulations and with everything else to make sure that the case is likely to be successful. However, there are certain things that the employer may need to do. So for example, if one of the options that the employer selects is to place a posting on their website, we need you to do that. We don't have access to your website, or there's a notice of filing that has to be physically posted. We need the employer to do that. We will give it to you. We'll draft it to you. We'll give you specific instructions, but we need you to actually post it. And like I said, we give very specific and detailed instructions, and we follow up to make sure that everything's staying on track. The next thing the employer will need to do is to review any applications or resumes that come in. That's something that has to be done by the employer. It cannot be done by the individual, by the attorney, and it definitely can't be done by the foreign national employee. So that's something that, whoever typically reviews resumes usually is the person involved in that, at least the initial screening. And if an applicant looks like they're qualified on the face of their application, then the employer may need to conduct an interview. So that may be an additional step. And we need clear and clean documentation of why a person is not qualified, or if they are qualified, we need to have a conversation about that. So that's one of the more intense parts, I think, for the employer of the PERM labor certification process, depending on how many applicants they have. Sometimes it's not a big thing at all, but other times they do have a number of applicants that they have to sift through and accurately determine if they meet the minimum requirements for the position. The attorney, we can guide the employers on reasons that are okay and not okay to reject someone, but it does have to be done by the employer. And then the employer, of course, will review, and the employee will review the 9089. That's the form that we use to submit to Department of Labor after all of the recruitment is done. We document all of that and some other information on this form, the 9089, and we ask the employer to confirm the accuracy of that information before we submit it. And then once the labor certification is approved, we need the employer to sign the labor certification application before we submit it with the next step of the process, which is the I-140 petition. And we'll have a separate video on the role of the employer in the I-140 petition stage of the process. But this is primarily what's involved for the employer in the labor certification stage of the process. So I hope that this information has been helpful. If you are thinking about starting the green card process for your employee, or if you are an employee and you're interested in starting the process, we'd be happy to have a conversation, a consultation to talk to you in more detail about what that looks like and help you come up with a plan. There will be a screen at the end of this video that has our contact information, so you can reach out to us to set a consultation. We would love to help you. This is what we do all day, every day with our clients, and we love doing it and love helping people reach their goals. My name is Emily Sumner with Sumner Immigration Law. We assist clients from around the world and around the United States with family-based and employment-based immigration matters. If you found this video helpful, I hope that you'll share it with a friend or a colleague, and make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next video. Until next time, I'm Emily Sumner.